Richard
You will
Westbrook
leave this
didn't notice the
establishment
trembling
at once.
hands reaching toward his table until the waiter's sharp voice cut through the elegant hum of conversation. The man standing beside him wore clothes that had seen better days, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of a lifetime lived outdoors. Richard looked up from his filet mignon, his expression hardening as he took in the stranger's appearance. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry," the man said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't eaten in 3 days. Could you spare just a few dollars?" The restaurant fell silent. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over tables draped in white linen. But all Richard could see was how this man's presence disrupted the perfection he'd paid for. What he did next would haunt him for reasons he couldn't yet imagine. The beggar's eyes held something Richard couldn't quite place. Was it hope, or something deeper? "Where are you watching this story from tonight?" Richard Westbrook had built his fortune from nothing, or so he told himself at every opportunity. At 68 years old, he'd climbed from a modest childhood in Pittsburgh to the pinnacle of success, owning a chain of high-end restaurants across the East Coast. His flagship establishment, the Sterling Room, was where he dined every Friday evening, always at the same corner table where he could survey his domain. The walls were decorated with photographs of him shaking hands with governors and celebrities, a testament to how far he'd come. That Friday evening had started like any other. Richard arrived precisely at 7, nodded curtly to the hostess, and settled into his usual spot. He'd ordered his standard meal, the $40 filet with truffle butter, paired with a wine older than most of his employees. He was reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet when the commotion began near the entrance. The maître d', a young man named Marcus, whom Richard had hired just 6 months ago, was trying to politely turn someone away. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a dress code," Marcus was saying, his voice strained with discomfort. Richard glanced up, annoyed by the disturbance. The man in question looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair that needed cutting and clothes that had been worn thin by time and weather. His jacket was patched at the elbows, and his shoes were held together with what appeared to be duct tape. But it wasn't his appearance that struck Richard. It was the quiet dignity in how he stood, straight-backed, despite his obvious poverty. "I understand," the man said gently. "I was just hoping someone might spare a little kindness tonight." Marcus looked uncertain, his eyes darting between the homeless man and Richard's table. That's when the stranger noticed Richard watching him. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and something flickered in the older man's face. Recognition, perhaps, or simply resignation. He started walking slowly toward Richard's table, each step measured and deliberate. Richard's jaw tightened. This was his sanctuary, his palace, and he wasn't about to let some vagrant ruin his evening. "Excuse me, sir," the man said when he reached Richard's table, his voice soft but clear. "I'm sorry to bother you during your meal. My name's Thomas. I haven't eaten properly in 3 days, and I was wondering if you might have a few dollars to spare. I'm not asking for much, just enough for a sandwich from the deli down the street." He wrung his hands together as he spoke, a gesture that betrayed his discomfort at having to ask. Richard felt his face flush with anger. How dare this man approach him directly, bypassing the staff, making a scene in front of other diners? He could feel eyes turning toward them, could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. His reputation was built on excellence, on maintaining standards, and this was unacceptable. "You need to leave," Richard said coldly, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "This is a private establishment. We don't allow panhandling here." Thomas's face fell, but he didn't move immediately. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just thought—" But Richard had already raised his hand, snapping his fingers sharply to summon Marcus. "Get him out of here," he ordered, not bothering to lower his voice. "And make sure he doesn't come back. Call security if you have to." The humiliation on Thomas's face was visible to everyone in the restaurant. Other diners looked down at their plates, uncomfortable witnesses to the scene unfolding. An elderly woman at a nearby table opened her purse, perhaps intending to help, but her husband placed a hand on her arm and shook his head. No one wanted to contradict Richard Westbrook in his own restaurant. Marcus approached reluctantly, his young face troubled. "Sir, please," he said to Thomas, his voice apologetic. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Thomas nodded slowly, that same quiet dignity never leaving his bearing. "I understand," he said. Then he looked directly at Richard, and in that moment, there was something in his eyes that made Richard's stomach twist with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was something closer to sadness, maybe even pity. "I'm sorry for disturbing your evening, Mr. Westbrook," Thomas said, and then he turned and walked toward the exit. Richard noticed how he favored his left leg slightly, as if each step caused him pain. As the door closed behind Thomas, Richard returned to his meal, but the steak had lost its appeal. He pushed the plate away and called for the check, suddenly eager to leave. He told himself he'd done the right thing, maintained standards, protected his business. But as he drove home to his empty mansion in the suburbs, he couldn't shake the image of Thomas's face, or the way the old man had looked at him with what seemed like understanding rather than contempt. Saturday morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through Richard's bedroom windows. He'd slept poorly, plagued by dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him feeling unsettled. Over coffee, he tried to focus on the newspaper, but his mind kept drifting back to the previous evening. He told himself it was just the disruption that bothered him, the breach of protocol. Nothing more. By noon, he'd almost convinced himself. He spent the afternoon at his office downtown, reviewing contracts and answering emails. His assistant, Janet, a grandmother of 5 who'd worked for him for 20 years, brought him lunch, a salad he hadn't ordered. "You look tired, Mr. Westbrook," she said, her voice carrying the gentle firmness of someone who'd earned the right to speak freely. "Everything all right?" Richard waved her concern away. "Just didn't sleep well. Thank you for the salad." But Janet lingered in the doorway. "I heard about what happened at the Sterling Room last night," she said carefully. "Word travels fast among the staff." Richard's shoulders stiffened. "A vagrant tried to panhandle in my restaurant. I handled it appropriately." Janet was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, softer this time. "My brother went through some hard times after his wife died. Lost his job, lost his home. Good people can end up in difficult situations, Mr. Westbrook. It doesn't make them bad people." She left before Richard could respond, closing the door gently behind her. Her words stung more than they should have, mainly because they reminded him of something he'd spent decades trying to forget. His own father had nearly lost everything when Richard was 12, and they'd spent 6 months living with relatives, dependent on others' charity. That evening, Richard found himself driving past the Sterling Room, though he had no plans to dine there. Something drew him to the neighborhood, a restlessness he couldn't name. He parked down the street and sat in his car, watching people come and go from the restaurant's entrance. That's when he saw him, Thomas, standing across the street in the same worn jacket, watching the restaurant with an expression Richard couldn't quite read. It wasn't hunger or longing. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like nostalgia. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel. He should drive away, go home, forget about this. But instead, he found himself getting out of the car and walking toward Thomas. The old man noticed him approaching and straightened slightly, but he didn't run or back away. He simply waited. "You came back," Richard said, and he was surprised by how accusatory it sounded. "I thought I made it clear. I'm not here to cause trouble," Thomas interrupted gently. "I was just remembering." He gazed at the restaurant's facade, at the elegant script of its name etched in gold above the door. "I used to know this building when it was something else, a long time ago. Before it was fancy." Richard frowned. "This building has been part of my restaurant group for 15 years. Before that, it was abandoned." Thomas smiled faintly, and there was something achingly sad in that smile. "Before it was abandoned, it was Giuseppe's diner. My father ran it for 32 years. I worked the counter every summer from the time I was 14 until I left for—" He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself. "Well, that doesn't matter now." Richard felt something shift in his chest. "Your father owned this building?" Thomas nodded. "He did. Served the best meatball subs you ever tasted." This neighborhood was different then. Working folks, families, everyone knew everyone. When the economy changed and the factories closed, people moved away. "My father held on as long as he could, but eventually," he shrugged. "Life happens." The two men stood in silence for a moment, and Richard found himself seeing the building differently. imagining it as it must have been, simpler, warmer, filled with the smell of home cooking instead of truffle butter. "Why didn't you say something yesterday?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now. "Why ask for money if you have this history?" Thomas looked at him with those penetrating eyes. "Would it have mattered? Would knowing my father once owned this place have made me less hungry, or made you more willing to show kindness to a stranger?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He had no answer, at least none that didn't make him feel small. Thomas started to walk away, that slight limp still evident in his gait. "Wait," Richard called out, surprising himself. Thomas paused and turned back. Have you eaten today?" Richard asked. A long moment passed. "No," Thomas admitted, "but that's all right. I'll manage." "I always do." Richard pulled out his wallet, but Thomas raised his hand. "I don't want your money, Mr. Westbrook. Last night wasn't really about the food. It was about wanting to feel human again, to be seen as a person instead of a problem to be removed." He smiled again. That same sad smile. "I got my answer. If this moment touched your heart, please give this story a thumbs up. It helps us share more stories like this one." As Thomas disappeared into the evening shadows, Richard stood rooted to the spot, his wallet still in his hand. Questions crowded his mind. Who was this man really? What had happened to reduce him from a diner owner's son to sleeping on the streets? And why did Richard suddenly feel like he'd missed something crucial? Some piece of information that would make everything make sense. He returned to his car, but instead of going home, he sat there for an hour, staring at nothing, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him in a way he couldn't quite understand. Sunday morning, Richard woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He needed to know more about Thomas, not out of guilt, he told himself, but out of, what? Curiosity? Responsibility? He wasn't sure anymore. He drove to the Sterling Room early, before the Sunday brunch crowd arrived, and let himself in with his master key. The office files were meticulous, as he insisted they be. He found the building's deed and purchase documents, tracing the ownership back through the years. There it was, Giuseppe's Family Diner, owned by Giuseppe and Maria Brennan from 1968 to 2000. Then a succession of failed businesses, followed by years of vacancy before Richard bought it in 2010. But it was the name that stopped him cold. Brennan. Thomas Brennan. Richard's hands began to shake as he pulled out his phone and searched the name. The first result made his breath catch in his throat. Colonel Thomas Brennan, United States Army, retired, awarded the Bronze Star for valor in Vietnam, served 2 additional tours in the Middle East as a military advisor, honorably discharged in 2005 after 34 years of service. The photograph showed a younger Thomas in dress uniform, his chest decorated with medals, his bearing proud and strong. This was the man Richard had ordered thrown out of his restaurant like trash. Richard sank into his office chair, the phone trembling in his hand. He kept reading. After retirement, Thomas had worked with veterans organizations, helping others transition to civilian life. He'd been married. His wife Helen died in 2018. They'd had no children. The most recent article was from 3 years ago, a small piece in a veterans newsletter about Thomas volunteering at a soup kitchen. Then nothing. The trail went cold, as if Thomas had simply disappeared from public record. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. The dignity in Thomas's bearing, military training, the way he'd stood straight despite his circumstances, pride that wouldn't bend even when everything else had. The limp, perhaps an old war injury? Richard thought of his own father, who'd also served and had always taught him to respect those who'd worn the uniform. They gave everything for us, his father used to say. The least we can do is remember that. But Richard had forgotten. In his climb toward success, he'd forgotten so many things. He spent the rest of Sunday searching for Thomas, driving through the neighborhoods near the restaurant, checking parks and underpasses where the homeless sometimes gathered. He found others who knew Thomas. A woman at a shelter said he sometimes slept there but hadn't been in for a few days. A man at a soup kitchen remembered him but said Thomas was too proud to come regularly. He helps serve more than he eats, the man said. Says others need it more than he does. Each piece of information made Richard's chest tighten with an emotion he'd almost forgotten. Shame, deep and burning. Monday morning, Richard called Janet into his office. "I need you to help me find someone," he said, and for the first time in years, he heard his voice crack with emotion. He told her everything, about Thomas, about the restaurant, about the things he'd learned. Janet listened without judgment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Westbrook," she finally said. "My brother I mentioned? He was a veteran too. After his wife died, he just broke. The VA couldn't help enough, and he was too proud to ask family. We found him eventually, got him back on his feet, but those years he was lost." Her voice caught. "Those years changed him, changed all of us." "I don't know how to make this right," Richard admitted, and the confession felt like removing armor he'd worn for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Janet reached across the desk and patted his hand, a grandmother's gesture that nearly undid him completely. "You find him," she said firmly, "and you treat him like the hero he is. That's how you start. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment when you realized you'd misjudged someone completely? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories." That afternoon, Richard closed his office early and resumed his search. He visited every shelter, every soup kitchen, every place where the forgotten gathered. At each location, people remembered Thomas, always helping others, always kind, never complaining. It painted a picture of a man who'd served his entire life in one way or another, who'd lost everything but never his humanity. And Richard had thrown him out. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his life building walls to keep people out, to maintain his image of success. Thomas had spent his life serving others, even when he had nothing left to give. Which of them was really rich? As evening shadows lengthened, Richard stood outside the Sterling room again, wondering if Thomas would return. He had to. Richard needed to make this right, needed to apologize, needed to understand. But more than that, he needed Thomas to know that his story mattered, that he wasn't invisible. The question was, would he get that chance? Tuesday morning brought rain, cold and persistent. Richard arrived at the Sterling room before dawn, carrying 2 large thermoses of coffee and a box of pastries from the bakery next door. If Thomas came back, he'd be ready. But hours passed with no sign of him. The staff arrived, confused to find their boss sitting in the front window, staring out at the street. Marcus, the young maitre d', approached cautiously. "Mr. Westbrook? Is everything all right?" Richard turned to him, and Marcus was startled by the change in his employer's face. The hard edges had softened somehow, replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. "Marcus, that man from Friday night, the one I had you remove. Do you remember him?" Marcus nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. I felt terrible about—" Richard held up his hand. "I know, I did too. I need to find him. If you see him, please call me immediately." "And Marcus?" The young man waited. "Thank you for treating him with kindness, even when I didn't." The day crawled by. Richard canceled meetings, ignored calls, and spent his time between the restaurant and the streets, searching. By evening, when Thomas still hadn't appeared, Richard made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He returned to the shelter where he'd spoken to the woman on Sunday. She was there again, serving dinner. "I'm looking for Thomas Brennan," Richard said. And something in his voice must have conveyed his urgency because she didn't brush him off this time. "You're the restaurant man," she said, recognition dawning. "Thomas mentioned you." Richard's heart leapt. "He's here?" She shook her head. "No, but I know where he might be. There's an old warehouse on Oakmont Street. A bunch of vets stay there sometimes when the shelters are full. It's not safe, but—" She trailed off, worry creasing her face. "Thomas went there yesterday. Said he needed some quiet, but with this rain I'm worried. Some of the men are sick and that building's barely standing." Richard was out the door before she finished speaking. The warehouse was in a part of town he usually avoided, where broken windows and graffiti-marked buildings that Progress had forgotten. He found the address, a sagging brick structure with a collapsed section of roof. His expensive shoes squelched through puddles as he approached, rain soaking through his overcoat. A makeshift door, really just plywood, hung askew on one hinge. He pushed it open and stepped into darkness, broken only by the gray light filtering through holes in the ceiling. "Hello?" His voice echoed in the empty space. Thomas Brennan?" Movement in the far corner caught his eye. He picked his way carefully through debris, past empty sleeping bags and abandoned possessions that spoke of desperate lives. There, huddled against the wall beneath a section of intact roof, he found Thomas. The old man was wrapped in a thin blanket, shivering violently. His face was flushed with fever, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. "Thomas!" Richard dropped to his knees beside him, heedless of the filthy floor. Thomas's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Mr. Westbrook?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Am I dreaming?" Richard's hands shook as he felt Thomas's forehead, burning hot. "No, you're not dreaming. I've been looking for you. How long have you been sick?" Thomas tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Couple days. It's just a cold. I'll be fine." But Richard could see he wouldn't be fine. Without help, without warmth and medicine, Thomas might not survive the night. For a moment, Richard was paralyzed by the magnitude of what needed to happen next. Then training from decades of running businesses kicked in. Assess, decide, act. "We're getting you out of here," he said firmly. "Right now, no hospitals," Thomas protested weakly. "Can't afford—" But Richard was already pulling out his phone, calling 911. "This is Richard Westbrook. I need an ambulance at the old warehouse on Oakmont Street immediately. I have a 70-something-year-old man with fever and respiratory distress." "Yes, I'll stay on the line." While he waited, he removed his own coat and wrapped it around Thomas, adding its warmth to the threadbare blanket. Thomas's eyes had closed again, but Richard kept talking to him, keeping him conscious. "Stay with me, Thomas. Help is coming. I know about your service. I know about your father's diner. I know you're a hero, and I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry for how I treated you." Thomas's hand, thin and cold, grasped Richard's. "You didn't know," he murmured. "Most people don't see us, don't see what we used to be." Richard felt tears, hot and unexpected, slide down his face. I should have seen." The ambulance arrived within minutes, and soon Thomas was on a stretcher, paramedics working efficiently. Richard followed them out, climbed into his car, and drove behind the ambulance to the hospital. In the emergency room, he told them he was family, and no one questioned it. He sat in the waiting room, still in his mud-stained suit, and for the first time in 30 years, Richard Westbrook prayed. If you've been moved by this story, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and meaningful tales. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter. The doctor who finally came to speak with Richard was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes. "Mr. Brennan has pneumonia," she said. "Severe, but we caught it in time. Another day or two without treatment." She didn't need to finish. "He's stable now, on antibiotics and fluids. He'll need to stay for at least a week, maybe longer." Richard felt his whole body sag with relief. "Whatever he needs. I'll cover all expenses. Private room, the best care you can provide," the doctor smiled. "He's been asking for you. Room 304 when you're ready." Richard climbed the stairs slowly, using the time to gather his thoughts. What would he say? How could he possibly explain the transformation that had occurred in his heart over these past few days? When he pushed open the door to room 304, he found Thomas propped up in bed, oxygen tubes in his nose, but his eyes clearer than they'd been in the warehouse. Their gazes met, and Thomas managed a weak smile. "You saved my life," he said simply. Richard pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. "You saved mine first," he replied. "I just didn't know it at the time." Over the next hour, as rain continued to patter against the hospital window, they talked. Thomas shared his story, how after Helen died he'd spiraled into depression, how the VA counselor had tried to help, but Thomas had been too proud, too sure he could handle it alone. How medical bills from Helen's cancer had drained their savings, then his pension, how one missed rent payment led to another, and suddenly he was on the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and memories of a life that seemed like it belonged to someone else. "I'm not making excuses," Thomas said. "I made mistakes. Got too proud to ask for help until it was too late. But somewhere along the way I just got tired of fighting. It was easier to disappear." Richard understood that tiredness. He'd felt it himself in different ways. The weariness that came from maintaining an image, from always being strong, from never letting anyone see the cracks. When you came to the restaurant, Richard said slowly, "You weren't really there for food, were you?" Thomas shook his head. "I wanted to see my father's place one more time. Wanted to feel connected to something that mattered. And when I saw all those successful people inside living the life I used to have..." He paused. "I guess I wanted to see if anyone would still see me as a person. You gave me my answer, just not the one I'd hoped for." The words cut deep, but Richard didn't look away. "I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. I've spent so much time building walls, protecting what I have, that I forgot what my own father taught me, that success means nothing if you don't have compassion." Over the following week, as Thomas recovered, Richard became a daily visitor. He brought books, magazines, and home-cooked meals from the Sterling Room's kitchen. More importantly, he brought news. He'd contacted the VA and arranged for Thomas to receive the full benefits he was entitled to, but had never claimed. He'd also found Thomas a small apartment near the restaurant, paid the first year's rent, and furnished it with simple but comfortable pieces. But Thomas's pride was a hard thing to navigate. "I can't accept charity," he protested. "It's not charity," Richard countered. "It's restitution. And besides, I have a job offer for you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I'm 72 years old and just got out of the hospital." Richard smiled. "I know. And I'm 68 and realizing I've run my restaurants with efficiency, but without soul. I want to convert the Sterling Room back to something closer to what your father had. Not a diner exactly, but something that serves the community, that welcomes everyone. I need someone who remembers what that looks like, someone who understands service in the truest sense." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "You're serious?" Richard nodded. "Completely. I'll need time to make the changes, but yes. Will you help me?" The day Thomas was discharged, Richard picked him up personally. They drove to the apartment together, and when Thomas saw it, small but clean, with windows that caught the afternoon sun, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say," he managed. Richard put a hand on his shoulder. "Say you'll give me a chance to be the person my father raised me to be. Say you'll help me remember what matters." 6 months later, the Sterling Room had a new name, Giuseppe's Table, honoring Thomas's father. The menu still included some upscale items, but it also featured affordable options, and every Thursday veterans ate free. Thomas worked 3 days a week, greeting guests and sharing stories with anyone who'd listen. The photographs on the walls now included images from the original diner, alongside pictures of Thomas in uniform and the Bronze Star he'd earned. Richard had never been happier. His other restaurants remained profitable, but Giuseppe's Table became his favorite, the one where he spent most of his time. He and Thomas became close friends, bonded by their mutual journey from pride to humility to grace. On Friday evenings, they'd sit together at that same corner table where everything had changed. And they'd share a meal, usually meatball subs, made from Giuseppe's original recipe that Thomas had remembered. They'd talk about their lives, their regrets, their hopes. And Richard would remember that night, the moment when his comfortable world had been shaken by an old man in threadbare clothes who taught him that wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the kindness we show to strangers, who might not be strangers at all. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and second chances, please remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments about what this story meant to you, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May we all remember to see each other's humanity, especially in those moments when it's hardest to do so.